I'm glad to see he still pays attention to a former dean. I have to tell you one small thing about Bill. I think Bill was a part of a group that arrived in my office literally the morning that I had said yes to the provost at Georgia Tech, that I would be dean. And I go back to the dean's suite. It wasn't even a dean at that time, but there was a little conference room. And in comes this group that said, you know, we've been doing a lot of work here on visualization and usability, and we think you ought to found a center. Well, the GVU Center at Georgia Tech is still going. Bill was one of the key players in that, and it is great to be here today and see what a magnificent operation you have here. A wonderful campus. I have never been in Charlotte, let alone on campus. And when I looked at my schedule, I said, they're interviewing me for an assistant professor's position, because I've got an appointment every 30 minutes, including 2 after this talk, so I've got to be on time. But it has been a joy, because I am learning so much today, and I've enjoyed every meeting I've had, and I'm sure I'll enjoy the others too. So with that, I'd better get going here. I told Bill that this was a bit of a difficult talk to put together, because I gave this talk in a longer form, which is posted on my website at Georgia Tech, and so you can go look at that if you wish, and it even includes all the words, so you can go and check whether I faithfully reproduced it, because I'm going to do it largely informally today, but it was done initially for a sort of a major talk in Europe, and I wanted to make sure I got it all right. So with that, I want to talk about basically 5 or 6 things today. You can read that outline, I think, and especially I'm hoping, and I've set my timer here, which should go off and make noise, so that we'll have a little time for Q&A. I'm sure everybody, students included, understand this kind of a simple diagram that if you think just think about it, you know, how's this university supported? How are the research projects supported? Well, there's something out there called society, and we're all members of it, but when we're here on campus and we're busily working, we're only interested in the fact that they send us funding, and maybe we send some research results back. I guess that should be reversed. No, society sends funding to us, and maybe we send some research results back. And oh, by the way, we send some well-educated, well-trained students back to society too, which at the end of the day is probably the most important output of a university. There are more complicated models of the interaction, and here is one, and one that has fairly common and widespread usage in the science community these days, and it's called Pasteur's quadrant. And very simply, and again, you can go read the full lecture, and there's a set of references, by the way, that are listed there on my website, and so if you want to know more about this, you can go look it up there. You can see the 2 dimensions there. The models, or I should say the archetypes of those different quadrants. Niels Bohr, the famous physicist, was only interested in the science. He couldn't care less about practical applications. In fact, looked down his nose on them. Thomas Edison, the famous American inventor, had over 1,000 patents, had no use for scientific theories, had no use for basic research. He was only interested in solving practical problems and doing it in a very successful but a very informal and seat-of-the-pants kind of way that clearly wouldn't pass today. Pasteur is a good model because Pasteur, a famous chemist back in 150 years ago in France, Belgium actually, was called in as a consultant to the local beer brewery. They were having a fermentation problem. And in the process of solving their fermentation problems, he discovered some effects that ultimately, along with the work of some others, led to the founding of the field of medical microbiology, which of course is an exceedingly important field today, and is a good example of it's not even use-driven research that a lot of us do or have done in my case, but it was working on a practical problem. But in working on that practical problem, he saw some effects, some artifacts, and he said, I don't understand this, and there aren't theories to explain this. And out of that observation came a whole important science. So what I'm talking about today, and really my primary message, is to elaborate a little bit on the interactions between science and society. And I'm using the term science here in a very general way, not just pure science, physics, mathematics, although mathematics says we're not a science, and they're not, they're mathematics. But also to include engineering and more generally technology, and certainly computer science, which, as I trust everybody in this room knows, is sometimes science, sometimes engineering, and a lot of the time neither. We are our own thing. And I fairly recently wrote a little paper on that. So again, you can go look up the thing. So, and I want to use the internet and the development of the internet as a case study. Now it turns out the development of the internet is kind of an interesting story. How many of you know very much about how the internet developed, where it came from, and so forth? Okay, well, I'll give you a 5-minute history of the internet. But first, a test. I wasn't a professor for 35 plus years for nothing. Do you think it began before 1990? How many? Raise your hand. Before 1980? Keep your hands up. Before 1970? Before 1960? Very good. You've read some history. It did indeed. Do you think that the internet was developed to meet stated needs of society? No. Well, you may not be entirely correct. As a result of basic scientific research? No, okay. Just an engineering project? Those are the only possibilities, folks. Come on, you gotta pick something. Okay, so let me give you the quick history. 1950s, yes. There were conceptual beginnings. And we're going to come back to that. I'm going to flip through these very quickly to leave us a little time, and so that I can go into a little more depth on the development of packet switching, which really started in the 1950s, and I believe is a nice little case history. It's probably not the best, but it's the best I could come up with in our field of the interaction between scientific activity, more or less engineering in this case, and society, quote unquote, more broadly. So yes, things started in the 1950s. In the 1960s, there were early implementations. Arpanet, notably, but some others as well, including a project that I'll mention in the context of packet switching in Great Britain. The 1970s really saw the advent of the first useful networks that people were actually using for real things. I must ask, those of you that had some correct answers, are you networking faculty, students?
I teach communication.
Yeah, very good. Okay. So don't answer any more questions, please. Don't ask any more questions. 1980 saw the beginning of the consolidation that we have today. So before that, and indeed in the 1980s, as I'll illustrate in a moment, there were a number of networks. And guess what? They didn't communicate. between them very well. In fact, you wouldn't believe the addresses you had to type out. I was doing a sabbatical in 1985, and I was in Europe. I was writing a book, and I had a little Trash 80, for those of you old enough to remember a TRS-80, and I typed a whole book on that, but I would try to use it to communicate over EARN, which was the European Research Network, which communicated with BitNet, which was an IBM network, which would communicate with the Arpanet, which communicated with NSFNet, which could actually get me back to my graduate students in California. And the addresses were like this long, and you had to know every connection almost in between. It was ridiculous. So the 80s started to see the beginning of that kind of consolidation. The 90s really was the emergence of the internet. Now I see some fairly young faces here, and a few of us with a little older visage. But you know, freshmen beginning, what, about beginning just about now, maybe a couple years ago, freshmen coming into colleges had never known a world without the internet. For some of us, that's a little hard to imagine. For people the age of my grandchildren, they've never known anything different. The 2000s, we've seen a huge enhancement and expansion. And the questions, of course, are what comes next? And of course, that makes a very interesting story, yet to be told by some of you. So just a few pictures to kind of illustrate it. Here is a diagram of the ARPA network in December 1969. Huge, isn't it? 2 nodes. 3 really, UCLA, UC Santa Barbara, SRI, and a connection back to Utah. Thank you. Couldn't read from here. So it was more than 2 nodes, but the very first was 2 nodes. Anyway, it had 4. Big deal, okay? Forget the date up there. Just to point out, this was the sort of a partial map of the BitNet EARN net worth topology, which was kind of the thing I was trying to navigate from Europe in 1985. And don't even try to read it. Seems to be some Japanese characters there, and who knows what else. In the 80s, we started to get, and here's a map of Usenet. Back, I'm not sure there's a date on here, but just to indicate, obviously in the US there was a whole lot going on, starting to be some long-haul connections, a lot happening in Western Europe. Russia wasn't there, etc. Interestingly, I mentioned about early usage. Early usage of the Arpanet and all was largely, almost entirely for scientific work. In fact, it was supposed to be only for scientific work. Okay, I actually was using it in 1971 because I had been at CMU as a graduate student and then a postdoc. When I moved to a faculty position in California, I wanted to stay in touch with the group I'd been working with in Pittsburgh. Both they and a place close to where I was at Irvine were both on the Arpanet, and by various kinds of connections, some of which weren't entirely legal, I was able to connect back to Pittsburgh as early as 1971 for scientific work. And occasionally we would send a few messages too, which of course became the killer app in those days. But interestingly, as early as the 80s, earlier I'm sure, but in terms of things known, there were usage of networking that were starting to appear, some of which didn't ultimately work very well, weren't big successes, but were forerunners of things we have today. How many of you had ever heard of the Minitel? Few of you, okay. The apartment that we were renting in Paris when I was on sabbatical actually had one, kind of sitting on a shelf. I tried to use it a time or two, but France Telecom wasn't real great in those days. And so I never really successfully used it. But it was a little dedicated terminal that was supposed to allow you to do all kinds of things, including some entertainment kinds of things, on this little terminal. Very, very early usage. But the point is, in terms of history, it was starting to point the way to some of the kinds of usage we have today of the internet. Here's a picture of the NSF-net backbone. I think this snapshot is somewhere around 92 or something like that. There's a history there that I won't go into at the moment of how ARPA decided, or DARPA by that point, decided they didn't want to be in the networking business. Military networks, MILNet, had been built based on that architecture. Something called TheoryNet quickly morphed into CSNet. You can imagine what CS stands for, which quickly morphed into NSFNet. And it was then NSF that took the leadership to combine NSFNet, which was by the late 80s serving a large fraction of the civilian scientific community, with Arpanet and the usage that it was having with a few sites, but using the technology. In fact, NSFNet was the first major network that mandated the use of TCP/IP, which then became the fundamental set of protocols. And I trust that all of you know the history from there. If you don't, that's another lecture. Have me back. First commercial browser. Some of you are old enough to remember days before the first commercial browser. Actually, Netscape came out of Mosaic, which was done at the University of Illinois, where I know you were probably a graduate student at the time.
Mark Andreessen was working with my advisor for a while.
Okay, and as I recall, the story is that he was between, he was like a staff programmer or something at NCSA, was between projects, and they said, well, go do something interesting. And he built this thing called Mosaic, which coupled with the web stuff that was going on at CERN, voila, he got the idea, and he's now Mr. Technology in Silicon Valley. He probably hasn't sent you any checks recently either, has he? Here's a map of the internet around 2003. I think this is like the dean has on his wall, isn't it? Yeah. Your picture looks much better than this.
That one was 2004.
2004, and it's probably 10 times as dense, easily. But just to illustrate growth for an audience, some audiences that aren't aware of that sort of thing. So, the question is, what do you think the internet is headed toward? Consider the explosion of wireless devices. In 1995, 15 years ago, there were less than 100 million wireless devices in common uses. You know, not taxicab radios, but this sort of thing. Today, there are more than 4 billion. A study by the European Commission last year found that there were more cell phones, mobile phones, in operation in the European Union than there were people. How many of you carry more than one cell phone or such device? I'll bet you there are several people with iPads and iPhones, right? Yeah. There you go. So that's not too surprising. And we all know, in this room, we all know what devices like an iPhone can do today compared to what the old clamshell that my wife used up until a year ago, sitting in the drawer at home, could do. And we thought that was pretty wonderful. The First cell phone I had was 92, and it was the size of this bottle. It's like one of those, I'm serious, it was like one of those old Motorola things that you see in the ads. Right. It was a good phone. I thought, wow, this is really great technology. Consider another situation, though, that very little has changed in the past 15 to 20 years in terms of the basic concepts on which the internet is based. And the demands for bandwidth, for connectivity, for service guarantees, for new functionality is increasing dramatically. So what's going to happen? Well, some people feel that we may be off on this track here. You can see where those tracks lead, right? Over the cliff. What we want to do, though, is not stop it. We want to do things that will cause the train to switch onto, and you may notice if you look carefully, those tracks are set, that switch is set so that if a train comes along here, it's going to go off the cliff. Now, some of us believe something can be done about that. There's a reference to this book, and actually Jonathan's a big supporter of the internet. It's just, he says, we're going to, and this is one of the biggest problems. This is called a tethered appliance. It's tethered because AT&T, without special stuff, I can only use it on their network, and I can only do things that they want me to do, and I can only put the apps on it that they want me to do. We all know that. And that's one of the things that makes it so great, but at the same time, it poses some problems that could kill the innovation that we've been seeing in the internet world over the last 15 to 20 years. So just think about those things. So now, for a little more detail, let's go back and think about the interaction of technical work and society. And I've been making very broad, general, sweeping statements capturing 50 years of history in maybe a little more than 5 minutes, but let's talk about the development of packet switching. There were three independent streams of work that were initially completely independent of each other because, hey, they were done before the internet, and they were done before everybody carried a cell phone, and they were done before everybody traveled to 17 conferences a year on 4 continents. Eventually they merged. They merged in the Arpanet. But each came from different motivations, and I'm going to take a look at that. And the degree and type of interaction with society varied with each project. Let me start with a young man. Well, this was a picture when he did the work. He was a young man then. Interestingly, Paul Barron, who I have known for 40 years, is still active. He's both developing new technology and funding it as a venture capitalist on the West Coast. So, you know, I look at people like that and I say, because he's probably 85, I say, I'm really young. I got to keep going here. I am. Anyway, that's another story. So what did he do? He was a young systems engineer, Berkeley degree, I believe, not a PhD, at the RAND Corporation. The RAND Corporation is a contract research organization, does typically classified work for the U.S. government, largely the U.S. Air Force. It was very, very important back in those days. He was assigned the task. He had been doing some radio engineering prior to that, which was an important point. And there's a lot more detail on this, both in my written part of my speech and as well as in various books. He was assigned the task of designing a survivable U.S. telecommunications system that could withstand a nuclear attack. This was really the start of the Cold War. The Russians are going to rain atomic weapons down on us. The question that had been posed to the RAND Corporation was, what will happen to the telephone system? If we are attacked, will the president be able to issue orders from the White House, etc.? And the answer was no, probably won't. with the existing centralized type of phone system. So he knew about a number of things. He was a smart guy, is a smart guy. He knew about radio store and forward techniques, among other technical things. And starting in 1959, worked on this problem and developed and published in 1962 the idea of packets that would be rooted along an architecture that was packet-based, store and forward, distributed nodes. Sound like the internet? Yeah. He performed some simulations. He's a good technical person to confirm that what he was asserting would work. He wrote an 11-volume set of tech reports that were published somewhere around '64. He sold that idea. Remember, RAND was funded by the Defense Department. He sold that idea to the US Defense Department. They said, okay, we're going to build a network to really show that this works. And they started on it, but he was following it along, I guess as chief engineer or something, and he decided that the people assigned to build this didn't have a clue because people didn't understand digital in the '60s. They were good communications engineers, but all they knew were standard circuit technology and so on. And so he said, I'm not going to have these jerks working on my project because they don't know what they're doing with it, and they'll take my design and they'll so screw it up that then nobody will pay any attention to it. Interesting point, as I already said. Next person, another young man, also still very active today. Go to UCLA and you can take his course, where he's been a professor since 1964. In 1959, well, let me read you something. Again, gentleman I've known many years, and I had talked to him before I wrote this speech up last year, and I said, tell me a little about, you know, how it was you came up with the idea. And here's what he said. He said, in 1959, I began to work with the legendary Claude Shannon. Anybody ever heard of him? At MIT on my PhD research. However, Shannon had solved most of the important problems, and what were left were problems that were extremely hard and most likely of relatively little significance. I was surrounded by computers. He was working at the MIT RAD lab, it was called at the time, a big systems lab, did government work. I was surrounded by computers and realized that it would soon be necessary for them to communicate with each other. The existing technology of telephony was woefully inadequate for communication among such bursty data sources. And so I decided to devote my PhD research to solving this problem. Moreover, I had an approach to meeting this challenge and recognized that my research would have impact. So, as I noted, he developed that idea, and in his PhD thesis in 1962, a scanned version of which you can find on his website at UCLA. In about '63, he went to UCLA as a professor, assistant, needless to say, wrote the first book on packet switching called Communication Nets, became a classic. And in it, he develops the queuing theory and so forth that in many cases is still the basis for a lot of the internet technology. Later, it turns out, if you know LA, UCLA is about 6 miles from Santa Monica, where the RAND Corporation is. So here are these two guys working 6 miles apart, and they didn't know of each other's work. Talk about communication or lack thereof. But they met. Len participated in the very early days of the Arpanet. You may have noticed on that chart, one of the nodes was the UCLA node. And he's still active today. Third person is Donald Davies. Donald was a Brit. He was older, so he didn't die particularly young, but he did pass away Does anybody remember about 5, 6 years ago, maybe as many as 10? He was a staff member at something called the National Physical Laboratory, spoken in good British, called NPL in the late 40s. He worked with Alan Turing. Anybody ever heard of Alan Turing? Alan Turing, what did Alan Turing do? He helped break the Enigma codes during World War II. He also did something in computer science theory and all. I'm not quite sure what all that was about. But he also helped build one of the very earliest computers called the ACE. In fact, he was the chief engineer on it, and Donald Davies was his assistant. There was a big flap, and Turing left, and Davies took over and ultimately built a reduced version called Pilot ACE, and then later was the designer of a second machine called the Deuce, you know, Ace, Deuce, Tray, etc. And the Deuce, a commercial version, became a very successful early commercial computer in Britain in the 1950s. He then went on and worked with British, he worked on projects, government projects, some with industry, etc., but pretty much all aimed at helping British computer industry stay competitive. Remember that, we'll come back to it. He rejoined NPL in 1966. He developed a form of packet switching. His ideas, Paul Barron's ideas, Len Kleinrock's ideas, I think primarily Barron's and Kleinrock's, but there is some controversy about that, and I won't try to resolve it here. Probably can't ever be resolved. All were brought together in the Arpanet and the early design of that. Davies actually designed a national system for all of Britain, but couldn't get the government post office. In those days, the PTOs, Post and Telegraph Operations and Telephony, or PTT, Telephony and Telegraph, were generally run by the government in Europe and were highly conservative, still are in those places where they still exist, and he couldn't get them to build it. So he built a reduced version at NPL, a major laboratory in all fields, not just computing, that operated as their main network as late as 1986. So it clearly was successful. He's now deceased. All right, let's analyze a little bit the interaction between these projects and society. First, let's look at the presumed source of initial motivation. Barron didn't choose that project. He was assigned to work on a specific piece of a societal program. It wasn't like there was a national referendum, but it was the Defense Department trying to ensure that America was kept safe, national defense, and that was clearly a high priority for our society, any society, to preserve itself. And he was assigned to work on that. So it was society that said to Barron, in effect, go work on this project. Kleinrock, on the other hand, had a very deep scientific purpose. He was trying to find a thesis topic, which for those of you that are PhD students can identify with. And I think we can give him a little more credit than that. A large amount of fundamental scientific curiosity, the ability to look at something and say, wow, you know, what those guys are doing today, they've got people taking tapes off this machine and running down the hall and mounting those tapes on another machine to transfer data. Why don't they have a wire between them, etc. Davies primarily was responding to a societal problem, because in the mid-60s, when he rejoined NPL, Britain was in pretty dire economic straits. The British computer industry, which at that time was pretty viable, or had been pretty viable, several large companies, was starting to really go downhill. And the British government wanted to try to really do something like that, almost a stimulus package, but not just cash, but getting NPL to do some research to try to help the British computer industry stay competitive. Sound familiar? So that was really the source of his motivation. Now let's look at the probable interaction with society, and I say that advisedly, because what I really mean is interaction with somebody other than themselves during the process of developing their ideas on packet switching. With Barron, it was pretty limited to a very narrow set of professional and technical colleagues and supervisors. He wasn't working with a large group. He wasn't running to Washington every week to say, now thinking of this, what do you think? He was sitting off in California, given a problem, given the resources to think about it and work on it, and told solve the problem. And I'm sure that he interacted with people there at the Rand Corporation and perhaps a few other technical colleagues, although because their work was classified, I'm sure that he wasn't able to just go over to Berkeley or up to Stanford or down to find out what his former professors were thinking. Kleinrock's interactions, I think you can imagine, were also pretty limited. All of you either are, have been, or in a few cases will be graduate students. And you talk to your thesis advisors and you talk to your fellow graduate students, but that's about it. So you're not interacting with anybody much broader during that. And that certainly, I'm sure, was true of Kleinrock, especially in those days. Davies had a much broader interaction because over time he was working with government, he was working with industry, he was out there trying to understand what would help industry in Britain, the computer industry, in the mid-60s become more competitive. So the point that I'm trying to get across is that in all of these cases, society was supporting them, the broader society, in some fashion or another. But the way in which they were motivated, the way in which they found or were assigned their problem was different. And the interaction with society as they did their work was different in each case. Different and both in extent and in nature. So what can we learn from that? Well, first, that the impact is often very smaller on some technical work. I'm talking about things in general now, than you might think. Okay, so Davies' work did not succeed in revitalizing the British computer industry. Barron's work did not protect us ultimately from the Russians. Other things did. We, fortunately, never needed that kind of a communications network. On the other hand, you can easily see, has packet switching had a large impact? Yes. I was attending a reception, I don't know, 6, 7 years ago when Bob Kahn and Vint Cerf were getting an award. And this was a reception the night before for them. And a group of us were standing around talking with Bob at this reception. And somebody said, Bob, when you invented the TCP/IP protocol years ago, did you have any idea that it was going to have the impact that it has had? Bob thought a minute and he said, well, here amongst friends, I'll tell you, no. We had no idea. But he said, after about the 10th time that somebody asked me that question, I said, well, of course we knew. We knew exactly what the internet was going to become, and that's why we invented TCP/IP. A second thing is that the eventual result may be quite different than intended. Paul Barron was just trying to protect the telecommunications system from nuclear attack. while that's still important, perhaps it is nowhere near as important in some ways. Obviously it's still important, but this is not the Cold War anymore. Oftentimes factors other than technical influence the outcomes, right? Paul Barron, good work. Britain could have had a national network before the US even started to think about it. He was thinking ahead. He was thinking we could build a network that would serve all kinds of purposes in Great Britain. And boy, would that ever be competitive for us. And the stodgy old government telecommunications office couldn't see it that way. So, didn't happen. But it had nothing to do with the technology, other than it wasn't what they knew. The human element is often the key to the outcome. One of the reasons that Bob Kahn and Vint Cerf were successful was that they were in a position at DARPA, later in other positions, and they ultimately knew how to work and sell their ideas in ways, and others then said, oh, that's a really good technical idea, like the designers of TheoryNet and NSFNet and CSNet and all, and said, that's a good idea over there, we're going to use that. Voila. The technical result may lead to broad use and adaptation, which may then lead to new research, and I believe that's where we are today with the internet. Those early technical results, packet switching and other things, have led to the kind of broad usage of the internet that we see today, which now is rejuvenating the whole field of networking research, and it is starting to provide the basis for new research in other fields. Online surveys are real simple, but online, all kinds of online research in the social sciences that could never have been done before. Need I remind you, Google, how many of you know where it came from? An NSF-supported research project by the IIS division.
Was that during your time?
Pardon me?
Was that during your time?
No, it was in between my two times. I was there when the internet was getting put together as a division director, and I came back in the early 2000s. No, it was around 92, and it was a research project to Jeff Ullman, and Spanish name, he was at Princeton, then at Stanford, database, help me somebody, Spanish name, hyphenated, we all know who I mean, okay? That guy. I want to say Victor, but it's not Victor. Anyway, and it was on multimedia databases. Didn't have anything to do with networking. And there were a couple graduate students. One of them was an NSF fellow. The other had had a research, an RA, a research assistantship, but funded by this NSF grant. And one of the tasks they were assigned was to go look at previous work in databases and multimedia databases and access. This was 92, 93, 94, somewhere along in there. And they came across something called Pagerank Algorithm. And they said, I bet we could improve on that. And they start playing around with it. It wasn't part of the project, but they start playing around with it. And so they start doing it on a computer in, I think, the garage of, I believe it was Larry's girlfriend's parents or something. You know, a little bit off campus, so it was sort of legal. Well, and there's the result. Has that had impact? Yeah. Was it society saying, go invent Google? No. Unintended consequences. Okay, let's end with, and well, this is going to go off in a minute, and remind me we've got 10 minutes left, 12 minutes, and that's just about right. Some effective interactions with society. Thank you. Now, how do I turn it off, somebody?
Slide.
Pardon me?
That ball, just slide. Donate it to a student.
There we go. Donate to what? Unintended consequence. I couldn't turn it off. So how do you interact better with society? Well, we start with something in our favor, and that is science and scientists, technologists in general, tend to be respected by society. At a minimum, because they say, oh, you're a scientist, you must be really smart. Yeah, you know, there's varying degrees of that. One of the things that's important always is to maintain the integrity of science. The integrity, and remember, I'm talking here about engineering work, I'm talking about technical work, I'm talking about what every one of you do and does. It's extremely important that you maintain the standards of we're basing our conclusions on data, not guesses. Experimentation where that's appropriate to get the data you know or are in the process of learning that mantra. It's important to communicate in how your work at some level relates to more global issues and concerns. Now, it may not relate directly, and I told somebody this afternoon about a little story about how the algorithm that is used by Google to run the auctions on the little ads that appear on the side actually is based on some computer science theory work on auctions that was done 15 years before, written up in a paper and forgotten. Somebody found it and said, oh, that might really help us make Google better. Also more profitable. But Google, at least for the most part, does good things with its profits. There are lots of scientific studies of the interaction between science and society, such as I started with. They're kind of useful. You should know about them as a mature technical person, but it's not something you need to study every day. Assisting policymakers to understand what we do is absolutely essential, even when it is that kind of abstract theory. And being able to explain things in understandable terms to lay people is extremely important. And of course, always stick to facts, which is really the essence of maintaining integrity. So things to think about and take some action on. Clearly, the interaction between science and society is going to continue to increase. The understanding of science by society is not real great today, and it'll worsen if positive steps are not taken. It's your responsibility, my responsibility as scientists to take the lead in improving understanding. The consequences of not improving mutual understanding could be and will be increasingly dangerous. I need only point to the unfortunate situation today where something over half of the population doesn't believe that global warming is happening. You can argue about what's causing it, although seems to be fairly good evidence there, but it is happening. And to deny that, to not believe that, as much of our society, an educated society, believes, I don't need to explain to you, could be exceedingly dangerous. So working with society, scientists can help address society's problems. So with that, we have a few minutes left, and I'd love to take some questions.
Thank you. All right. We have time for questions. Yes.
What, in your opinion, would be some nice steps to stop global warming?
Turn off the lights.
Yeah, why are all these lights on? because then we'd be in the dark. There are many, of course. Education has to be at the core of it. And not just education in the sense of everybody going to college, because a lot of people do go to college and high school and da-da-da-da. Let me just, this is on my website, so just a preview there, you can be looking at it. What else?
Let me pose a question.
Yes, Dean.
By the way, I gave a talk to our graduates here before, not long ago, about using inspired research, particularly in terms of path towards quadrant. By the way, Peter is the man who told me several years ago that there is a book called Path Towards Quadrant. This book is going to be very important in terms of science policy of this country and funding. So read it. So I did. Now, what do you see going to the future in terms of the science policy, the funding policy of this country, which you the ultimate insight that we are moving towards? That how does that affect our research, our graduate student training, particularly doctoral student training going forward?
If I knew, of course, I could probably sell futures. But the good news is that fundamental science has long had bipartisan support, so that both Republicans and Democrats generally believe in fundamental scientific research. One of the most worrying things about some of these fringe elements is that they simply reject science. They literally will look at a fact and say, I don't believe that, period. But fortunately, that's still a fringe. But that's where the importance of all of us making sure that people do understand what we do and what the results of science and scientific activity can be. In terms of overall policy, you know, it comes and goes and so forth. I think that it will continue. I've seen in the last 20 years an increased awareness by policy people who typically are political science majors and or lawyers that they've got to have at least good advisors who can speak to them on their terms but represent strong opinions and the facts from the scientific community. Beyond that, it's very hard to say.
Let me be a little bit more specific. In the context of path towards quadrant, right? We are moving this country from the 60s, perhaps a little bit early. The funding structure is mostly based on the linear model from basic to applied technology. And wouldn't you say that the model, the two-dimensional model represented by the path towards quadrant now become more prevalent in the thinking of federal funding agencies? Yes,
very much so. And I'll give you a good example. I am affiliated with a small consulting group. One of the other members, and a man that I work with a good bit, is Eric Bloch, who was the director of the National Science Foundation back in the 80s. Was also an IBM vice president and a computer engineer. He was one of the primary designers of the Stretch computer, one of the very earliest supercomputers. In a talk, he recently made the point that he believes the National Science Foundation should no longer be organized in these stovepipes of physics, computing, biology, but instead in institutes or whatever you want to call them, but that are much more problem-focused. Pasteur's quadrant. Now, bear in mind, he's an engineer by training and proclivity. But I think you're right. In general, certainly the funding is going much more toward the Pasteur's quadrant kind of things. The ITR program was absolutely in the center of Pasteur's quadrant. It was a shame when we were not able to continue that funding, although we had the money and we used it in other ways that hopefully have continued that tradition of helping our field investigate things beyond just a narrow set of core topics. Oh, that's one of my sons.
Any other questions? Yes.
You commented on the relationship between technology and society. Can you share your thoughts on the influence of the technology on society?
Oh, sure.
I'm thinking, for example, despite the wonderful internet and the availability of information, I'll guess that a disproportionate amount of technology is devoted these days to entertainment.
Sure.
As opposed to
Sure.
communication or knowledge.
Sure.
And what can the internet do to sort of move people along so that they become more scientific rather than just entertainment?
Well, I guess there are, and in fact, I think I heard of some today. There certainly are efforts to utilize games for education, utilize games to teach people specific tasks, specific things, utilizing games, internet, computer-based, whatever, to enhance their interest in science. There's a wonderful display in the Museum of Natural History in Washington, where I live, that it's a display on the origins of man, and which means humankind. And one of the displays is about the decisions that human beings make and the effect. And it's basically a little game, and you know, my 8-year-old grandson plays it and loves it, and it teaches him, because guess what? It's an interactive computer game, and sure, it could be networked or whatever to make it even richer, but basically it's got a country with a couple of neighboring countries, and you have to make some decisions. Should we cut down all the forests? Or should we build more dams? Or should we devote all our resources to curing cancer? Questions of that sort. And you have to make decisions, and then a simulation says, but the long-term results of your decision is that your country goes broke and is invaded and taken over by your aggressive neighbors. So there are ways being looked at that can use our technology in better ways. But like any technology, it can be used for bad just as well as it can be used for good. And I cannot explain human behavior any better than you. You know that the first usage of any technology is almost always pornographic. And the second usage, which is closely related, is entertainment. Ask your colleagues in the psychology department.
Another question?
Yes, sir.
Regarding the understanding between society and science, are you seeing, and does this paper imply that there's a downtrend on that, or is the trend improving in the...
Right now, I tend to think that it's getting worse. I think when I was growing up in the 1950s, the average person tended to know and be interested in science. I mean, Scientific American was fairly widely read back then. I'd be willing to bet by a larger percentage of the population than today. That's one aspect, one trend that's kind of disturbing, partly because of sometimes too much distraction by the entertainment, television, you know. It's called cable news, but nah, it's entertainment. And we all, if you stop and think about it for more than a microsecond, you know that whether it's Fox or CNN or MSNBC, it's really entertainment. and very little content or information typically. So that's one trend, and then the trend of, at the moment, an increasing number of people who believe, for whatever reasons, in extreme solutions, throw all the government out, go back to total basics, or get rid of everything, that kind of attitude, that fundamentalism. Quite honestly, personal opinion, obviously everything I've said is a personal opinion except what's based on fact. Fundamentalism of all kinds, whether it's Christian, Islamist, Jewish, or Hindu in the case of India, or agnosticism, that kind of fundamentalism, which typically is not based on facts and scientific reasoning, rational reasoning, is the biggest threat that our civilizations, and I don't mean just America, faces.
Well, we have
That's probably a good place to stop before I get myself in trouble.
the process of applying for assistant professor.